something, Sammy, you got to be different. So I was like, okay. So I went in there and I told him, I said, because I was practicing.
Samuel Monroe Jr., the actor remembered for Menace II Society, had spent months battling a devastating medical crisis before his death, and now the final moments he shared publicly are being watched again for clues about what was happening behind the scenes. For many viewers, seeing Samuel during the last stage of his life feels completely different now, because the audience knows something that was still uncertain at the time. His condition would eventually become too serious to overcome. Samuel Monroe Jr. passed away at 52 after a prolonged hospitalization that began in April, following an illness his family said was initially misdiagnosed. His mother, Joyce Patton, later confirmed his death on August 27, bringing an end to months of uncertainty, prayers, and desperate hope from those closest to him. But before that confirmation, Samuel's family had repeatedly shared updates about his condition, and those updates revealed just how complicated his medical battle had become. Samuel was not simply dealing with one health problem. According to his family, he became ill while filming in Las Vegas and was later diagnosed with meningitis after they said the condition had gone unrecognized for months. By the time the illness was properly identified, the situation had become much more serious, eventually affecting his brain and spine and leading to a chain of complications that required intensive medical treatment. That is where the story becomes particularly difficult to understand, because there were moments when it looked as though Samuel might actually be improving. His family had reasons to hope. At one point, doctors were able to stop dialysis after his kidney function improved, and his blood pressure had stabilized enough that some medications were no longer necessary. Those developments gave his loved ones something they desperately needed after weeks of frightening uncertainty: the possibility that Samuel could recover. His family continued to share updates and supporters continued to pray, but the medical battle was far from over. Samuel later experienced additional complications, including MRSA pneumonia, seizures, and brain swelling, according to reports about his condition. He underwent multiple brain surgeries and remained under intensive medical care as doctors tried to manage the increasingly complex situation. For people outside the hospital, every update created another question. If his kidneys had improved, could the rest of his body recover too? If his blood pressure had stabilized, was that a sign that he was finally turning a corner? And if family members could still see signs that Samuel might hear them, could there still be a path toward recovery? Those questions became part of the emotional roller coaster his family experienced throughout the summer. His sister reportedly described moments when Samuel kept his eyes open during a visit, giving the family reason to believe that he might still be aware of the people around him. In a situation filled with uncertainty, even a small response could feel enormous. But as the weeks passed, the setbacks became more serious. His family later revealed concerns about swelling in his brain and seizures, while doctors reportedly warned that the neurological damage could be severe. By August, Samuel was reportedly in a medically induced coma and remained dependent on life support. The situation had moved far beyond the initial illness that had brought him to the hospital. It had become a prolonged fight involving one complication after another, and his family was forced to confront possibilities they had desperately hoped would never become reality. That is why the final interview or public appearance associated with Samuel's last period is now attracting so much attention. Viewers are going back and watching his expressions, his words, and the circumstances surrounding his final public moments, wondering whether there was something they should have recognized. Was there a warning sign? Was his health already changing in ways that were difficult to see? Could anyone have understood how serious the situation would become? Those questions are understandable, but they also need to be handled carefully. A person watching an old interview after a tragedy can easily interpret ordinary details differently because they already know the ending. What seems like a warning sign afterward may not have appeared unusual at the time. And unless Samuel or his family specifically identified something in that interview as a medical warning, it would be misleading to claim that the recording predicted his death. What the confirmed timeline does show, however, is that Samuel's illness had already become a major concern long before his final days. His family said the meningitis diagnosis came after months of misdiagnosis, and that delay was followed by increasingly serious complications. His wife, Shauna Stewart, publicly described the difficulties surrounding his condition, while the family worked to support his treatment and deal with the financial burden created by such an extended hospitalization. A fundraiser was established as Samuel remained in the hospital, and supporters were encouraged to help his family during the medical crisis. At the same time, a separate legal conflict emerged over who should have authority to handle Samuel's personal and financial affairs, while he remained unable to make decisions for himself. His wife challenged a conservatorship effort involving his mother, while his mother continued speaking publicly about her son's condition and asking for prayers. These disputes added another painful layer to an already emotional situation, but they also showed how serious Samuel's condition had become. His loved ones were no longer simply waiting for him to walk out of the hospital. They were trying to navigate decisions about his care, his future, and his affairs while hoping that he would somehow improve. And throughout all of this, Samuel's career remained the reason so many people outside his family cared about his story. For fans of Menace II Society, his face was instantly recognizable from a film that became one of the defining movies of its generation. But his career extended beyond that one role. He appeared in Tales from the Hood, Set It Off, The Players Club, Don't Be a Menace to South Central while drinking your juice in the Hood, and television productions including NYPD Blue. These were performances that made him part of a cinematic era remembered by millions, even if many viewers did not know everything about the actor behind those characters. That contrast makes his final months even more emotional. The man audiences remembered as a performer was suddenly being discussed through hospital updates, family statements, and reports about his medical condition. Instead of seeing Samuel on a film set, fans were seeing photographs and videos connected to a difficult period of his life. Instead of discussing his next role, people were waiting for news about whether he would recover. And instead of preparing for another chapter in his career, his family was preparing for possibilities no one wanted to accept. Yet there were still reasons for hope along the way. The improvement in his kidney function was one of them. His family's observations during visits were another. These moments mattered because they showed that the story was not simply a straight line toward tragedy. There were genuine moments when the people around Samuel had reason to believe that treatment might work. That is also why the later decline was so devastating. Hope had been present, and then the medical reality became increasingly difficult. As his brain swelling and seizures became part of the reported picture, the possibility of meaningful recovery appeared to grow more uncertain. By the time doctors reportedly warned about the possibility of a vegetative state, the family was facing an entirely different kind of decision-making. They had to think about Samuel's condition not just from one day to the next, but about what his future might look like if he survived. It is difficult to imagine the emotional weight of that situation. For months, his family had been waiting for signs of improvement, celebrating every positive development and trying to stay strong through every setback. Then came the news that the damage might be too severe. Still, they continued hopping. And on August 27, that long period of uncertainty finally ended when Joyce Patton confirmed that Samuel Monroe Jr. had passed away. He was 52 years old. The confirmation brought a wave of reactions from people who remembered him not only from Menace II Society, but from the many projects that followed. Fans began revisiting his performances, while others discovered the details of the medical battle that had taken place largely away from the public eye. His final interview and other public moments were suddenly being viewed through a completely different lens. People wanted to know what Samuel was thinking, how much he understood about his condition, and whether he had somehow sensed what was ahead. But there is no reason to assume that he knew the outcome. The most responsible way to understand those final moments is to see them as part of a much larger story about an actor whose health deteriorated over several months. The warning sign was not necessarily hidden inside one final interview. The warning signs were part of the broader medical timeline described by his family, an illness that was reportedly not diagnosed correctly for months, followed by serious complications that eventually required intensive treatment. His story is therefore less about finding one mysterious moment that supposedly predicted everything, and more about understanding how quickly a complicated medical crisis can change a person's life. Samuel's family saw those changes firsthand. They watched him move from illness to hospitalization, from treatment to temporary improvement, and then from hope to increasingly difficult medical setbacks. Every stage carried its own uncertainty, and while fans could only watch from a distance, his loved ones were living through every decision. That is why the final footage has become so emotional. The audience sees an actor they recognize, but behind that familiar face was a person whose family was already facing an enormous struggle. Knowing what happened afterward makes every moment seem heavier. A glance can feel significant, a sentence can sound like a clue, a quiet moment can suddenly feel like a farewell, but sometimes there is no hidden message. Sometimes a final public appearance is simply a moment that becomes meaningful because history gives it a different context. Samuel Monroe Jr.'s story deserves to be remembered in that way. Not simply as a viral hospital video, not merely as a final interview, and not only as a tragic headline, but as the final chapter of a long career and an even longer fight for recovery. His family fought to keep hope alive through months of uncertainty, and the people who remembered his work continued watching for any sign that he might get better. Unfortunately, that hope for recovery never came. Samuel Monroe Jr. passed away at 52, leaving behind performances that remain familiar to fans and a final medical journey that has raised difficult questions about diagnosis, complications, and the fragility of life. The images from his final months may continue circulating, but the most important thing to remember is the person behind them. Samuel was an actor whose work became part of a memorable era in film, a husband, a father, and a son whose family refused to stop hopping for him. His final moments should not be reduced to a single warning sign or a viral clip. They were part of a much bigger story, one that unfolded slowly, painfully, and unpredictably over months. And now that story has reached its heartbreaking conclusion. Samuel Monroe Jr. is gone, but the characters he brought to life and the memories he left with audiences will continue to keep his name alive long after the hospital updates and viral footage have faded from the headlines.